Well, hello friends. This is going to be a quick one. So what I'm going to do here is I'm trying to resurrect an old video from years and years ago, from 2009. So in 2009 I did a debate with a creationist by the name of Jerry Bergman. And honestly, it was terrible. It was just one of those experiences where I just realized that debates were a total waste of time. The topic of the debate was supposed to be, should intelligent design be taught in the schools? And I worked my butt off ahead of time. I prepped for this. I got all kinds of stuff together to explain exactly why intelligent design wasn't a good theory and why it shouldn't be taught. I gathered evidence about previous court cases, about policies in schools, all this kind of stuff. It was all wasted time because the guy's a loon. He just went off in all directions. Anyway, the centerpiece of my argument was this quote that was made by Paul Nelson, and he published it in Touchstone, a journal of mere Christianity. And he said, easily the biggest challenge facing the ID community is to develop a full-fledged theory of biological design. We don't have such a theory right now, and that's a real problem. Without a theory, it's very hard to know where to direct your research focus. Right now, we've got a bag of powerful intuitions and a handful of notions such as irreducible complexity and specified complexity, but as yet no general theory of biological design. So that's an admission that no, they don't have anything to teach. So why should we teach it in the schools? By the way, irreducible complexity is total bunk. I'm going to make a video later talking about that. Anyway, so we went to the debate and it was a packed house. They bust in lots of people from churches as they usually do. And Bergman just babbled. As you can see, if you stick around and watch the next 2 hours worth of video. Yeah, I hate to do that to you, but there it is. And again, I will credit the person who actually uploaded this and enhanced the audio for me. And I will include a link to them down below so you can go to their channel and give them some traffic as well. But I just wanted to make sure that this was under my name, since I'm the one who suffered terribly through this thing. Anyway, so nowadays my policy is don't waste your time with debates with these people, and you'll see why. Okay, so that's just a little prelude. Go enjoy, have fun. Talk to you later.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. Before I start, I want to congratulate P.Z. Myers on the good job he did in the film Expelled. Of the opposition, his was the most rational, most reasonable, and I don't know why he didn't end up on the cutting floor. Why did they include him? I don't know. He must have felt we need to have some reasonable people on the other side, but at any rate, the question is, now this wasn't my choice, this topic, but the question is, should ID be taught in the schools? And the answer is very simple. It is now everywhere. And I've done a number of surveys which documented the fact that it is taught everywhere in the schools. First, let me give you a definition of evolution. Evolution is a word where you can define in many different ways. You can define it in a way where everybody agrees, or ways in which hardly anyone disagrees. And the definition that I like is from the goo to you by way of the zoo, or, from molecules to man, which was actually the title of a biology book published a few years ago. The concern is not the survival of the fittest. That's obvious. It's obvious if you're more fit, you're more likely to survive. That's like saying rich people have a lot of money. That's not the concern. The concern is the arrival of the fittest. Where does the fittest come from? And in my area of research, cancer research, we're looking at mutations. Spent a lot of time looking at mutations, and it's fairly clear the effect that mutations has on the genome. And that's what I wanted to talk about today, but what do? You have to go along with the rules, so here we go. Scientists have proposed several theories as to the origin of biological information. Gemmules was one of Darwin's favorites. Panspermia was also talked about, orthogenesis, Lamarckianism, and so on. The view which is accepted today, by and large, is mutations. And in my conclusion, there is a serious problem with assuming that mutations is the origin of biological information. A little bit about my background, I think that may be helpful. My father was atheist, agnostic. He never really said, that was a few years ago when a lot of atheists were in the closet, but from my reactions with him and growing up with him, he was an atheist. Very involved in the humanist movement. I knew a number of the leaders in the humanist atheist movement back then. In fact, Lester Mondale, Walter Mondale's brother, married my father and my stepmother. So I got to know many of the people in this movement. My mother became a Jehovah's Witness when I was about 8, which you might think is strange, but, you know, you're 8. You don't have a lot of choice on what your family talks to you about. And by the way, you might learn one thing about Jehovah's Witnesses. They were the only group during World War II that were thrown in jail on both sides. Jehovah's Witnesses were imprisoned in Nazi Germany because they were one of the few groups, and you atheists out here, you listen to this, they were one of the few groups that actively and openly opposed the Nazi movement. Many of the churches basically went along with Nazism. Jehovah's Witnesses were also thrown in jail in this country. I faced a 4-year sentence because of my opposition to the war based on my religious background. And when I was a Jehovah's Witness, I always read a lot, mostly in science, but I also read a lot about Jehovah's Witnesses. And I began to read everything I could find on the witnesses, at first to defend them. But as time went on, I found it more and more difficult to defend the witnesses. And I love going to used bookstores, so I looked for books on Jehovah's Witnesses. And I ended up with a huge collection of books on Jehovah's Witnesses. In fact, my library was published in a book you can see here, which is the 13th most common book in WorldCat out of the 1,300 books that are in libraries in the United States, which means my book here was in the top 1%, and most of the book is my personal library. Well, when I became disillusioned with Jehovah's Witnesses, and I should mention about Jehovah's Witnesses, they are very anti-all church. We were taught that the Catholic Church is of Satan. The Protestant churches were much better. Slightly better, but not much better. So I had a lot of negative feedback relative to religion, period, as I was growing up, both from my father and from my mother. So because of my background in biology and science, I became an atheist, and I was actually quite happy as an atheist. I got to know many people. Madeline Mary O'Hare is one I mentioned here, Gordon Stein, and Gary DeYoung, who is from Minnesota, by the way. And in time, I became disenchanted with the atheist movement. A major reason why, ironically, was because scholarly, I found so much of the atheist work was simply horribly deficient. I can give you some examples if you prefer. I ended up in the same route traveling through the Watchtower as traveling through the atheist movement. And interestingly, when I left the Watchtower, you are what they call excommunicated. I can no longer talk to my friends, and in my case, family members, because once you leave, you're seen as a dog that returns to its vomit. When I left the atheist movement, surprisingly, the same thing happened. And not with everybody. I must mention, Gordon Stein, we remained friends until he died, and Gary DeYoung we lost contact with. These two people were very supportive, even though they were atheists. But by and large, many people would no longer talk to me. I'd write to my atheist friends, no answer. I had several articles that were slated for publication in atheist journals, and guess what? They never appeared. I sent new articles to atheist journals and didn't even get the courtesy of a rejection. And word came back that I was a heretic and that it wouldn't be a good idea to associate with someone like me. Well, I no longer agreed with their worldview. And examples of the inaccuracy is the Crusades, Nazism, was blamed on the church. Now, the church's problem with Nazism was not that they enthusiastically supported Nazism. The church's problem was not commission, but omission. They did virtually nothing, unfortunately. Galileo is probably the most abused story historically relative to the relationship between the church and science. Bruno, another case, I can read some quotes here, which if we get time later on, I will, the Inquisition and so on. By and large, I saw the atheists only saw the bad in Christianity. When I went to atheist meetings, we talked about primarily all the bad Christians and how the world would be a really nice place if only there was all those bad Christians were gone. And I agreed with them by and large, but they weren't all bad. They saw nothing good about Christianity. And even the Watchtower, even though I left and they shunned me and I couldn't talk to my friends, the fact is there are good things about the Watchtower, as there are good things about Christians. And this one-sidedness I thought was inappropriate. What bothered me a lot was that you cannot judge a religion by those who don't follow it. And when they judge Christianity, they're obviously judging it by those who aren't following it. And that bothered me. Okay? One thing that bothered me the most, though, is that even though I left the Watchtower and left the atheists, I strongly did and will defend their right to what they believe. And I saw on the now I'm not saying that about the atheist group here. I don't know. So I can't judge. From what I heard, the atheist group here is a bunch of nice people. Is that right?
But my experience.
That's yeah, okay. So that's right. So I can't judge everyone, but nonetheless, my experience was they wanted to eliminate religion, especially Christianity, first from the public square, then from the private sphere, and eventually from society. And I guess being an atheist, there was really a lot of joy because we won court case after court case. We had favorable press by the media. We had a lot of support. I felt I was in the majority. Of course, statistically I wasn't, but that's how I felt. And essentially, I saw the atheist movement that I was part of as someone intolerant. No room for theists. And leaving the atheist was problematic because where do I go? Not that one needs to go somewhere, but a belief structure is important for most people. We need to have a belief structure to orient our life. And so I couldn't accept theism because of my negative experience, because of the Watchtower experience, and also because of the simple fact that, well, we got here by evolution, so what's the point of believing in God? If you survey people as to why they believe in God, most people will give you as the primary reason because we have a creation, therefore we must have a creator. So then I decided to reevaluate what I believed, and what I started out with was evolution. I listed every proof of Darwinism that I could find in the textbooks that I used in college, and here you can see I list 6, vestigial organs, homology, and so on, and I evaluated each one of these one at a time. The first one I chose was vestigial organs. And this is the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is a current edition, and it says, the human body, for instance, has more than 100 such vestigial organs. The appendix, the fused pterygal vertebra, the coccyx, in other words, wisdom teeth, and so on. So is this true? So I thought I could easily find out whether or not it's true, or at least begin to make progress. Went to a medical school library, and I searched and looked for references relative to if these structures had any use, and I found eventually all of them, in humans at least, had a very clear function. All of them. And now we know for the appendix, for example, there are more than several functions. There's several functions which were recently discovered. I wrote a book called Vestigial Organs Are Fully Functional, worked with a professor, George Howe, who was a PhD from Ohio State, and a professor also who was a professor at a medical school in St. Louis. And as a result of my research, I have now over 800 publications, primarily looking at this question whether or not evolution is based on, and again, keep in mind my definition, is based on the evidence. And I concluded based on science alone. I wasn't looking at religious books. I was looking at science alone. Based on scientific research, secular sources alone, I conclude that Darwinism simply did not hold up. And my conclusion now is evolution, given my definition, did not occur and could not occur, and that conclusion is a result of science. The next step then for me, and for many people, by the way, this next step does not occur. I have a number of friends who do not buy into evolution, who are still atheists or agnostics. It's the next step to conclude that, therefore, we must to explain the origin of life, the universe, etc., I then looked at theism and eventually came back to a theistic position, which was actually very different from the position that I was raised around. And so I was, for the second time, a heretic, and I wrote a book called Persuaded by the Evidence, which is back here, and I found my story is not at all unusual. There are a lot of people who became, first of all, believers in a creation, rejected Darwinism, and believed there was intelligence behind the creation, and some went on to become Christians, some did not. And the book basically documents a number of these cases. I have a list on the internet now of 3,000 PhD scientists who have, by and large, rejected orthodox Darwinism. Okay, what is taught? Well, I surveyed about 100 biology teachers, called them up, and asked them how they handle origins. I used an open-ended approach because I thought they'd be more open and honest. And this is what I found. Almost all the professors and teachers that I talked to taught creation and intelligent design. The problem is not whether it's taught, the problem is what is taught about creation or intelligent design. Okay? And I concluded that everyone is a creationist. The only difference is who is the creator. We're all creationists. Atheists believe that time and accumulation of mutations, outworking of natural law, chance, etc. is the creator. I believe that intelligence is behind the creation. So we're all creationists. The difference is who is the creator. When I interviewed these professors, I found that many taught theistic evolution. They taught that God used evolution to create. And my thought is, this is teaching religion. They're teaching religion widely in our schools and colleges. I thought that was unconstitutional. I don't teach religion, at least in science class. I don't think it's a good idea to teach religion in science class. And most ID supporters that I know agree. It is not a good idea to teach religion in a science class. Okay? You don't teach astronomy in a mathematics class. Well, I guess you could, but it's a matter of what's appropriate. And another approach I found was that religion and science are separate. Religion is here, religion's faith. Science is here, science is fact. This is also teaching religion. So I found I was the one who was not teaching religion, and most of the people I called up, talked to, were teaching religion. How about teachers who are creationists? Ironically, what they do is often ignore the subject. So it seems that the evolutionists are teaching religion, the creationists are not. And by the way, this study should be replicated. It needs to be larger, much more data. This study, for me, was a preliminary study which I did present at a conference recently. Okay, I could also mention some biology teachers who were evolutionists experienced problems, and especially at the high school level, and thought, I'll just avoid the whole subject. Didn't learn anything about evolution. And most IDP, all ID supporters that I know, believe that we need to teach more about evolution. The problem is we don't teach enough about evolution. Some say to their class, well, I don't believe in evolution, but I have to teach it. Well, that again is, I think, teaching religion. You're telling something about religion which I don't feel has a place in a science class. One professor, he was interesting. He taught at Purdue University, and I talked to a number of the students. He says, I teach all theories. Creationism, intelligent design, theistic evolution, panspermia. Really? Yes, he did. That's what he said. I talked to the students. They thought they loved it. They said, really interesting, and they learned about myths from other cultures. The Mayan myth and two or three other myths. And everyone I interviewed said, we really like this class. And he himself was an evolutionist. Well, he said he was. But nonetheless, he presented all theories. And I asked the students, was he fair? Yeah, he did a good job presenting all of the worldviews. Another approach is science has proven life originated by natural means. This falsifies theological explanations. Therefore, theology, God, false, not true. Science, fact, it's true. And again, this is teaching religion. In fact, one professor at University of Toledo, ironically, one professor said basically, if you don't agree with me, leave the class now. And several students dropped the class within the hour. I thought that was kind of inappropriate, but that's what he did. Okay, I could give you some case histories, but I'm running out of time. Let me give you an example. Or I could mention a couple of court cases. What have the courts said? Well, the courts have basically made it very clear that you can teach against religion. Okay? One court case that the Darwin doubters won was in Wisconsin, and the court ruled we have a right to talk about creation in a library. So if anybody questions your right to talk about creation in the library, you can refer them to this court case, which gave us this right. Moore versus Gaston Board of Education, this was a teacher who said Darwin's true, Genesis is false, there's no life after death, there's no heaven, there's no hell, when you die, and that's it. The school didn't like that, parents actually complained and the school responded, and they went to court and the judge said this is academic freedom. The teacher has a right to tell the students Darwinism is true, Genesis is false, there's no heaven, there's no hell, when you die. He went well beyond that, but that's a few examples of what he taught. So the courts have ruled consistently you cannot teach the problems with evolution. And my book, Slaughter the Dissonance, documents that. So in essence, I think we have state-enforced religion. So atheism is taught in the schools, directly or indirectly. So congratulations, your side is presented legally. And I'm not aware of a single case where the courts have ruled against teaching that worldview in the schools. And I have a problem with that. I don't think we should indoctrinate students in a worldview, which of course is what they're doing here. And by the way, many of the cases I looked at were people who were not teaching intelligent design or creation, but they were teaching problems with the Darwinian worldview, such as vestigial organs, which I could relate a number of examples. Okay, moving forward. I'll give you one quick example now, which is irreducible complexity, if I have time. The idea of irreducible complexity says, okay, I'll just summarize and then hopefully I can cover it later, but give you a definition. Irreducible complexity says there's a certain minimum number of parts that is necessary for something to function. In other words, there must be 2 or more parts for watches, and you name it, to function. The only exception are the fundamental particles, which would be leptons, electrons, for example, and quarks, up, the down, the top, the bottom, the strange, and the charm. So, aside from this, everything would be irreducibly complex. That has been well documented in science, and the fact is, as I'll talk about later, you can get in trouble for teaching the concept of irreducible complexity.
All right, well, that's our first speaker, Dr. Bergman. So we're going to now give 20 minutes to Dr. Myers. Take it away, PZ.
Very good. Well, thanks. I'm a little sorry that we were late. It was all my fault. Apologies. I will mention, first of all, that yes, there were like 4 hours of interviews done with me for Expelled, and they only kept 3 minutes. So that, yeah, I did something wrong.
That's more than some people.
Okay, well, let's go back to something completely different. Should intelligent design be taught in classrooms? And I say the answer is no, and it's emphatically no, because I'll give you 2 reasons. One, it's not science, and that means, secondarily, there is absolutely nothing to teach. Now, I teach biology, and there are a couple of things I need in order to be able to treat a subject as a science, and not simply an opinion or a recital of data. What I need is, first of all, a mechanism. If a student asks how the beaks of Darwin's finches, for instance, evolved, I need an explanation with some predictive power. I need to be able to talk about things like drift, natural selection, all these phenomena that have been thoroughly documented in the scientific literature. Or, if intelligent designers provided some other alternative, we could teach that, but they haven't so far. In addition to having a mechanism that I can get a handle on, that I can use to explain the concept in the classroom, I need evidence. I can't merely say that finches' beaks change size because a theory says they change. That's not science either. I need observations, measurements, experiments that show that the observed mechanism works. So everything in the science classroom should revolve around those 2 classes of information. The mechanism or theory, which provides a conceptual framework to understand the data, and it makes sense of the data. Without it, it's as pointless as memorizing statistics off of baseball cards without knowing the rules of baseball. So we need theory. And of course, the other piece is the data. Are there real-world observations that can be plugged into that theory? Can we make predictions? Can we test the theory? In many cases, we can do experiments in the classroom laboratory that test pieces of the theory, or we can go to the scientific literature and find thoroughly documented instances of these kinds of experiments and observations and use those in the classroom. So what about intelligent design? It turns out it has neither of those things, neither any mechanism nor any data behind it. There is no theory of ID. Simply stating that you think a designer did it is not sufficient. The question you need to answer for it to be a scientific issue is, how did the designer do it? You've got to provide that specific mechanism that we can use as a framework to look for evidence of the designer's actions. This is a major strike against making intelligent design a part of the curriculum. What exactly should we teach? Like I say, you can't just say a designer did it. That is inadequate. It gives us nothing to go on further. And furthermore, the creationists know this. I have to quote this particular comment that all the evolutionists love. All right, it's a great comment. It's from Paul Nelson. He made it in 2004 in a magazine called Touchstone, a journal of mere Christianity. And he's talking about the problems of intelligent design. And here's what he said. Easily, the biggest challenge facing the intelligent design community is to develop a full-fledged theory of biological design. We don't have such a theory now. I emphasize that. We do not have such a theory. And that's a real problem. Without a theory, it's hard to know where to direct your research focus. Right now, we've got a bag of powerful intuitions and a handful of notions such as irreducible complexity and specified complexity, but as yet, no general theory of biological design. That's a pretty serious problem. If you're going to be telling us we ought to be teaching this in the classroom and you're going to admit up front that you don't have a theory to teach, what are we supposed to do? And without a theory, how do we know where to direct your research focus? That's how Nelson put it. And that's an intelligent and appropriate thing to say. You need the theory to know where to look for the evidence supporting your ideas. How do you get data to support your positive claims? And that's the other part of that those two key components I mentioned. Remember, we need theory or mechanism, we need data. If you don't know where to look for the data, you're not going to be able to fill in that part either. Basically, what we demand is something more than a designer did it. We need a more detailed explanation of how the designer did it, which would suggest what kind of tool marks his actions would lead. Then we need a collection of data that shows those unique tool marks. And that word is important, unique. It has to be something that distinguishes it from a more natural theory of evolution that also proposes change over time, but doesn't impose the requirement that we have an intelligent designer do it. We need something that shows specifically that an intelligent designer did it. We don't have that data. At best, there are unconvincing attempts to claim that complexity is such a mark. Unfortunately, evolutionary biology generates complexity all over the place. So simply saying it was too complex, it must have evolved, or it must have been designed, is a fallacy. Evolution generates lots and lots of complexity in its normal operation. So put yourself in the place of the poor teacher asked to teach intelligent design. After announcing that some people think an intelligent agent created at least some kinds of life on Earth, what do you do next? I'm at a loss. There doesn't seem to be anything you can do next. There are no experiments that you can carry out in the classroom. There are no published papers that publish documented, reasonable pieces of evidence in support of the idea. There's nothing there. For instance, can you say anything about the nature of the designer? Now, in the case of evolution, we can say quite a bit about the nature of the processes involved. We can talk about mutation, we can talk about drift, we can talk about natural selection. And we can show experiments that show that these things exist, they actually do something. And we can show many instances where they've shaped populations. We get nothing like that from the intelligent design crowd. In fact, they are such intellectual cowards that they run away from any attempt to pin them down on exactly what they're talking about. A perfect example is to ask them a really simple question. A simple question to a scientist is you ask them, how old is the Earth and how do you know it? And what you discover in the scientific community is uniform, simple answers. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. We can use things like radiometric dating, using a number of different methods of radiometric dating. We can use astronomical information. We can use all kinds of data to show that it has to be that old. If you talk to the Discovery Institute, they are dedicated to this thing called the Big Tent, which means they are going to allow young Earth intelligent or young Earth creationists, old Earth creationists, intelligent design creationists, Christians, Muslims, everything in their Big Tent. And so they therefore refuse to answer the question. There is no firm answer from the creationists at the Discovery Institute on how old the Earth is. They permit answers to range from anywhere from about 5,000 years to over 5 billion years, which is a million-fold range. Those are pretty big error bars on what they expect. Now, what happens is that when you confront intelligent design creationists with these simple facts and ask them, okay, well, tell me, what are you going to teach in the classroom? They will stumble a bit. They can't present a theory, they can't present data. So what are they going to do instead? Well, they're going to do what I predict Dr. Bergman will do, and he's already done a bit of, and that is, let's complain about evolution. Let's find things to argue over in evolutionary theory. But I'll remind you that that's not part of the process of teaching a positive idea about science. You don't just carp about the opposition. You have to propose something. We need a theory of intelligent design. We need data in order for it to be taught. Now, there have been a couple of examples where people have tried to make the case that it should be taught in the classroom. And one I'll mention is that in 2002 in Ohio, they tried to ram a couple of things through in their science standards and get the teachers to be forced to teach about creationism. And one of the things they did is they put together an intelligent design lesson plan. Now that's a good start. That's what we want. If you're going to be teaching, you want a lesson plan. You want to know, what are the points I should be making? And as I've already told you, you should be making a point. What is this theory? What is this theory of intelligent design? What is the data, the evidence, the experiments? Unfortunately, when you look at this critical analysis of evolution, is what they called it, there's nothing like that. Again, it's more complaining about evolutionary biology. For instance, one of the key points in there is, have students consider aspects of evolutionary biology that are critically analyzed by scientists, such as Hox genes, biogeography, vestigial organs, boar-winged fruit flies, finches. These are all good evidence for evolution. What are you going to criticize about them? What are you going to bring up as an alternative? For instance, if you're going to talk about vestigial organs like the appendix, what's your explanation for the appendix then? Give me one. Evolutionary biologists have a pretty good one. It's a relic organ. It's a remnant of a larger organ that was much more significant in earlier stages of evolution. The intelligent design creationists can't do that. So ultimately what we're down to is, where's the theory of ID, where's the evidence, and they can't give it to us, and that's why it shouldn't be taught in the classroom. So remember this, to teach a scientific idea, you must provide a mechanism or theory and a body of observations and experiments to support it. And when asked to do this, in every case, the idealists are reduced to reciting often discredited gripes about evolution, and that's not what we need for a science class. That doesn't work. How much time do we have? Oh, good, okay. There's another dimension of this issue as well, and that is that Teaching is not a playground for teachers to spout off about whatever strikes their fancy. It is a position of responsibility. Teachers are legally and ethically obligated to teach a curriculum defined at the state and district levels. They have an obligation to their colleagues because at the same time they're teaching this biology course that discusses evolution, the students may be taking other courses that will depend on the information coming out of yours. In subsequent years of their coursework, they may take courses that follow on your course. And if you haven't presented the evidence that your colleagues expect that the students will have covered, you've made extra work for your friends. So that's not a good thing. And of course, the most important reason is that we're responsible to the students. We must give them accurate and appropriate information so they can make informed decisions as a citizen or have a good foundation for their future careers. Now, it doesn't matter whether you personally believe in creationism or not. That shouldn't be an issue here. The problem is that teaching creationism is a violation of professional responsibility. It flouts the requirements of the state-mandated science standards, and it may conflict with the goals of the local curriculum. And that curriculum is usually designed to instruct students over the course of multiple classes. Now, I know for a fact that students who have had their time wasted with misconceived creationist notions in the classroom, who learn nothing at all about evolution, are very poorly prepared for a degree program in college biology. This ought to be the ultimate bottom line. If you have a student in the high schools who you have hopes for, you'd like him to be something more than a ditch digger, I presume. And you may be thinking, my son or daughter would like to go into medical school, they'd like to get an advanced degree, they'd like to do research, all of these kinds of important things that some of us think are pretty cool. You are crippling them when you support the teaching of intelligent design in the classroom. Because what's going to happen is they're not going to get this body of knowledge that they need in order to succeed. I see it every year with students coming into my class, and this is not a class where I use creationists. No, that's not the case. This is not where I preach at them about atheism. Nothing like that is going on. It's just the facts. Here's the theory of evolution, here's the evidence, here's the experiments. We go over all of these things. And students who have not been exposed to them before suddenly find themselves working twice as hard as students who've been fully informed. And that's not fair. There's not much we can do about it, though. The other choice is that we turn our classrooms into a remedial class. And that means that all the students who are well prepared find themselves handicapped when they move on to the next year. In a lot of ways, the biology curriculum is on rails. You are expected to come into the classroom in your first year, and you're expected to cover the basics. You're supposed to understand basic chemistry, you're supposed to understand the basics of biology, and then every year after that, it gets harder and harder, more and more detailed. And if you knock out the foundations on the students first, you're hurting them. So that's what I mean when I say it's a professional responsibility to not waste the students' time with teaching intelligent design in the classroom. And I will stop there.
All right. So you made up for being late. You got
good.
4 minutes, 4.5 minutes, right? You're all set. Okay. So now we have. Let me reset this counter here. Now we're going to have 10-minute rebuttals from each speaker. Dr. Bergman will go first, and then after 10 minutes from Dr. Bergman, we'll get 10 minutes from Dr. Myers. Okay, Dr. Bergman.
I should have taken a course called Speed Talking in college, but I didn't take it, so what do you do? Darwin's finches, I teach the same thing you do. The need a theory, that's true, that's a problem. There is not a coherent theory of intelligent design. No published papers, not true at all. There are thousands of published papers. A lot of these people have to be in the closet, because once you publish a paper which you openly support ID, good luck publishing again, because it's very, very difficult. And so many of my colleagues that I know who publish ID papers are in the closet, and there are many. There are thousands of papers. One colleague alone has almost 600 papers that he's published in major journals in his area, but he's pretty much in the closet. He's not in the closet with me. Age of the Earth, intelligent design is looking at a very specific thing. They're not concerned with the Trinity, the age of the Earth, the flood, these other questions. They're focused on a very specific thing. They're not trying to answer theological questions. As you said, it's the Big Ten. That's true. And they're very concerned about very specific topics, such as evidence for intelligence in the natural world. So therefore, they don't concern themselves with the age of the Earth. My own experience, I would say 80 to 90% of intelligent design supporters are not young Earth creationists. The vast majority accept the 4.6 billion years for the age of the Earth. Appendix, hope you don't teach in medical school. All of the anatomy books that I've used, I've taught anatomy for 20 years, both in the medical school and in Northwest State. All the anatomy books that I used brought out specifically the several functions of the appendix. It's part of the body's immune system. A recent function now there's good evidence for is that it stores benign bacteria, so that if the colon bacteria is destroyed for some reason, it can be replaced effectively and rapidly with the bacteria, which basically fill up the places to reduce the likelihood of pathogenic bacteria taking over. And the students taught creation. The concern is they don't do as well. Actually, there are quite a few studies. Just last week, I was talking to a person who teaches at a Christian school, and they teach creationism in his school. They do annual testing, and they are on the average of 1 to 2 grades ahead of the public schools. There have been a number of studies of students who went to various schools that teach creationism, and it's found in general they are generally considerably ahead, sometimes as much as 3 grades ahead of their partners that go to a public school. One example of intelligent design, which I'll mention, started to, is irreducible complexity. Again, this is where the idea is for something to function, there must be 2 or more parts. I should mention this idea dates back to Aristotle. Michael Poloni, an Oxford professor who's dead now, in Science magazine, he published an article called Life's Irreducible Structure, where he talked about irreducible complexity, one of many articles which covers this. Human body, certainly irreducibly complex. You must have certain structures to function. Without these structures, you will not function. If you're looking at legs, well, you don't need them. There's certain parts you don't need them. Well, if you want to be a runner, generally it helps to have such structures. Thus, irreducible complexity is a concept I think that students should understand. The watch example, I mentioned the court have ruled, quote, the argument of irreducible complexity central to ID has been refuted in peer-reviewed research papers and has been rejected by the scientific community at large. And another quote, there's no peer-reviewed article supporting Professor Behe's arguments that certain complex molecule structures are irreducibly complex. And I have many, many other quotes which say the same thing. Widely accepted and widely taught in the journals that irreducible complexity has been refuted. Well, and here's another example. Let me give you an example. Quarks. Top, bottom, top, down, charm, strange, and so on, leptons. These are fundamental particles. Everything else is irreducibly complex. Mousetrap is a common example. I'll take a better example, the periodic table. In fact, there was a teacher in Ohio who was terminated, and in the court papers, a number of his teachers said he was let go because he, quote, taught the periodic table. Because the periodic table is irreducibly complex. A good example, to get carbon-12, you must have what? 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons. If you have anything else, you will not have a carbon-12 atom. It is clearly, unequivocally, irreducibly complex. Right? Anybody teach chemistry? You must have a certain number of protons, electrons, and neutrons. Radios, televisions, MRI, automobiles, all life. Can you get radio, TV, or life out of a single quark? Out of a lepton? You can't. Everything is irreducibly complex, isn't it? By reasoning, and this is what I was taught when I studied chemistry. So can you imagine it? Well, teacher being fired for teaching the periodic table. So this is a good example of the fact that this aspect of ID has been verified. And interestingly, the question is ID religion. Well, Dennis Alexander says he believes in God but not ID. I guess he must not have studied chemistry. David Berlinski doesn't believe in God, but he does believe in ID. Lawrence Krauss doesn't believe in God or ID. Bradley Monton, he is researching this question and still is undecided as to where he is. The concern is ID true or false? Well, we'll have to look at specific aspects of ID. And certainly relative to irreducible complexity, well, fine. If you believe that it's been refuted, as is commonly believed and as a number of biology textbooks state it has been refuted, then fine. Show me the radio that works on the basis of a single lepton. Show me the radio or the human being. I'd like to meet a young lady who consists of a single quark. You think she could reproduce? Could I see her? Well, no. Is that possible? Yet the literature is very clear. Irreducible complexity has been refuted. It hasn't been refuted. And this is a concern that I have. One reason why I wrote the book called The Slaughter of the Dissidents is that if you teach this concept and they believe that you may support ID, or in one case, the court trial, there was a lot of questions as to what church he went to. And they found out he went to the Assembly of God. I don't know much about that church, but evidently that's not the right church to go to. So they really pushed, yes, this is part of him, and therefore because he went to the Assembly of God, therefore he was teaching the periodic table, therefore we put this all together, he was obviously teaching intelligent design, therefore we felt justified in terminating him. When I follow my own students up, see how well they do in other classes, I find as a whole they have a better background in evolution because we're teaching both sides. And yet, still, it said, well, as P.Z. Myers said, the idea of vestigial organs in humans, I assume he's referring to, is still true. It's not true. All of the organs which have been claimed to be vestigial, all 100, have clearly been documented as having a clear function. They are useful. And in many ways, I believe, evolution has gotten in the way of understanding our knowledge about the biological world. When I was in school, I remember I asked a lot of questions, and the professor said, well, it evolved that way. Well, why is this true? Well, it evolved that way. Well, that doesn't answer why it's that way. Why does it function this way? Well, it evolved that way. Natural selection, mutations cause some variation. Natural selection selected this structure. Therefore, that's why it is this way. It doesn't answer the question. I realize we can do the same thing with God. Why is this the way it is? Well, God made it that way. Why is this the way it is? Well, evolved that way. Neither of those responses answer the question. We need to go beyond God did it and beyond evolution did it. To me, that's God of the gaps and evolution of the gaps. All too often we fill our gaps in knowledge with evolution. In medicine, my major focus, we can't do that. We have to understand why something works the way it does so that we can, in essence, understand the problem and therefore fix the problem, such as cancer. And saying it evolved that way or God created it that way, neither answers the question. And so therefore we need to look at the data, which, by the way, in my school we really push the scientific method, which I strongly support. Students need to understand the scientific method, how it works and why it works, and therefore we have the tools to understand whether or not Darwinism, from the goo to you by way of the zoo, is a viable explanation for what we see in the natural world.
Thank you. All right. So far you guys are both doing very well on time. There's 11 seconds left. All right. So, Dr. Myers, you have 10 minutes to respond.
Okay. Well, this is interesting. You know, I have all these notes on what intelligent design people say. We'll throw them in. Basically, what Dr. Bergman has done is basically redefined everything in very peculiar ways. For instance, to claim that there are thousands of intelligent design papers in the scientific literature because their authors believe in intelligent design but just haven't said anything about it, is very misleading, then those are not intelligent design papers. Okay, I may be an atheist, and I know that tens of thousands of scientists out there are atheists. But that does not mean that a paper that is describing a scientific result is an atheism paper. That's not the way it works. An intelligent design paper would discuss a specific concept in biology, would address it using theory of intelligent design, if there were one, and would show experiments and data to support it. There's no such paper out there. The only papers that have been published by the intelligent design theorists have all been rather speculative papers, theoretical papers that don't have any real data with them, and mainly exercise the author's mind in using his imagination to stretch things. Which, of course, does kind of fit with what Dr. Bergman has been saying. Is let's use our imagination to pull out whatever we want. As for the issue of vestigial organs, I'm glad we're talking about one specific issue. The problem there is that Dr. Bergman has a very peculiar definition of what a vestigial organ is. No evolutionary biologist defines a vestigial organ as an organ that has no function at all. That's simply not it. A vestigial organ is a reduced remnant of an organ that had a more substantial prior function. We can still have function. That doesn't rule it out at all. So, for instance, the appendix in other species, it's much more prominent, much larger, and what it is the storage and fermentation organ. And has been reduced to this little tiny stub in us human beings. Now, this little stub is sitting there. Our explanation for it is that it's a contingent feature of the organism, that it's there because ancestors had genes that formed this particular structure. But the fact that it is now sitting there means that it's still in danger of infection, so it contains immune system tissue. It contains these things called Peyer's patches, which are little concentrated nodules of immune system tissue to produce antibodies and things like that to fight off infection. That's all it is. That does not mean that the appendix is there as an immune system organ. It is secondarily being used as an immune system organ. Let's talk about irreducible complexity now. That was the strangest definition of irreducible complexity I have ever heard. Michael Behe, if you read his book, Darwin's Black Box, is very specific in what irreducible complexity means. He's talking about biochemical pathways, and he's saying that if you've got a long biochemical pathway, which if you remove any one piece of it, it loses all of its function, cannot make its terminal product, then that can't have evolved. That's very specific, okay? To extend it and say that a carbon atom is irreducibly complex, it doesn't make any sense at all. That's saying that the entire universe is irreducibly complex. There's no feature in this universe that is not irreducibly complex, which is not Behe's intent at all, and makes this particular question useless. We need specific things we can test it against to rule out whether something is irreducibly complex or not. Irreducible complexity as a legitimate concept in biochemistry and biology has been refuted many times. Remember, what it says is you've got a pathway with a number of steps, and if you lose one, you can't get to the final one. And that's true. We can find many biochemical pathways that have exactly that property. Some of them that Michael Behe has even mentioned. That if you remove a step in the blood clotting pathway, for instance, the whole pathway can't function. You end up with something like hemophilia, person bleeds to death. And it's entirely correct. However, it says nothing about how that pathway arose in the first place. Because what we can do is we can go out into nature and collect other species and ask, okay, what steps of the pathway do they have? And what we discovered is there are many representatives of organisms in our lineage who are missing pieces of that pathway. And blood clots just fine. What's going on in the origin of irreducibly complex pathways is that you've got a simpler pathway to begin with, you add an extra step, and various other processes then make that an indispensable part of the whole process. It says you can't remove it after the fact. But it says nothing about the prior state of the organism. So it's an incredibly misleading thing to use. First of all, it doesn't say what the proponents of irreducible complexity say. That is, it does not disprove evolution in any way. That's what we mean by it being refuted. And in particular, it doesn't fit this definition that Dr. Bergman has thrown out at you. I don't even know where to begin with that. Carbon atoms are not irreducibly complex. Irreducible complexity is used to argue that they could not have arisen by natural processes, that there's no pathway to arrive at that particular state. But if you talk to a physicist, they'll tell you, yeah, there's ways to make carbon atoms. It's going on in the sun right now. And it's not little angels busily knitting them together. What it is nuclear processes will build heavier and heavier molecules as time goes by, as the reactions proceed. One other thing I've got to address is, again, this whole business of the periodic table. I've read your book, but I don't remember the details of that case. I'll have to look it up later. It is in your book, right?
No, it's in the next book.
Okay.
5 volumes in the set.
Oh. So we have an unsourced case here. All right. It's just peculiar because I have several colleagues in the chemistry department at my university, and they teach the periodic table. I mean, I teach in the same auditorium. I walk in there, and there's a periodic table up there on the ceiling. It's very familiar. I can't quite imagine somebody saying you're fired because you teach the periodic table. I'll have to read your next book and see if you make a somewhat more believable case.
Please do.
Okay.
I still have a couple of minutes. 2 minutes, 20 seconds.
Okay. Let me say a few words preemptively about some of the things that I'm sure we'll hear about next is ideas about instructors who've been fired and lost their job, who've been, in the evocative words of his title, slaughtered for believing in things that other people don't believe in. This doesn't seem to be the case. There's a number of prominent cases where teachers have lost jobs. And it's partly because of what I told you earlier, that teaching is a responsibility. That teachers are told what pieces of the curriculum they are responsible to teach. And for instance, in high school biology, biology teachers are told, you're supposed to teach the evolution section. We need that. And similarly, the people in the biology section are told that, well, the earth science people are going to teach geology. And we like that because that helps us biologists because it's part of the story. There have been cases where teachers have been reassigned, and one of the more prominent ones was one that occurred right here in the state of Minnesota. I'll mention Rodney LeVake in 2000, who wanted to teach creationism, intelligent design in the classroom. And again, he did it the way I told you they would do it. And that is, instead of proposing a positive case for intelligent design, he was putting out these little nitpicking arguments against evolution. Things like the appendix is not a vestigial organ, etc. That's not making a case for intelligent design. He had a specific curriculum that required teaching, and he openly admitted that he had not taught the subject and that he had instead presented this laundry list of fallacious criticisms of evolution. And most importantly, he was not fired. He was reassigned to teach general science where he wouldn't have to have a conflict with his religious beliefs. So the court decision there basically affirmed is that schools have the right to set their curriculum. And that's the problem under debate here. Schools do not have intelligent design in the curriculum. Teachers shouldn't teach it. Okay, 8 seconds. I'll stop there.
Okay. Well done. All right. Well, so far we've really stayed right on schedule here. We were supposed to begin specific questions from each speaker to the other at 8:40, and by my watch it is 8:41. So I must be doing my job. All right. Dr. Bergman, do you have a question for Dr. Myers?
Yeah, I have a question. I've spoken at many audiences and always ask the audience if they know of anybody who is an out-of-the-closet ID supporter or creationist who got tenure. I haven't found anybody except 2 people. These were cases that happened a few years ago. Do you know any out-of-the-closet ID supporter or creationist who was openly out of the closet and who got tenure at a university?
No. And the problem there is?
So you're saying they should be terminated?
I'm saying in order to get tenure, what you have to have is basic competence in your discipline. You have to have a publication record in your discipline. You have to be able to interact and work with your colleagues in your discipline. And somebody who rejects the basic principles of biology is not somebody we want teaching biology. So yeah, I think it's entirely appropriate that somebody who promotes a theory that is not a theory, that has no evidence, should not be given tenure in a university department.
Okay.
Okay. Dr. Myers, you have a question for Dr. Bergman?
Well, I would like some explanation. How can you say that the carbon atom is irreducible complex? What is your personal definition of irreducible complexity, and how does it differ from Mike Behe's?
Okay, I correspond with Mike Behe on this, and so we agree. Irreducible complexity is where structures, if you remove beyond a certain point, the structure no longer works. It doesn't mean you can't remove a part. It means that there's a certain level where it is irreducibly complex and the structure no longer functions. And a good example, because it's nice and clear, is the periodic table. It's a good example of irreducible complexity. And I realize we have nucleosynthesis. That's not the concern. The concern is, to have a carbon atom, do you have to have a certain number of protons, electrons, and neutrons? Not an ion, but a carbon-12 atom. What do you have to have that? And that is a very clear example of irreducible complexity. And the only way one would not be irreducibly complex is if you can go down to the point where you have a fundamental particle, like a quark or a lepton, and they would be irreducibly complex. But everything above that would be irreducibly complex, including life, watches, radios, etc.
But this is defeating the entire intent of the irreducible complexity argument. Because the irreducible complexity argument is being used to argue that structures couldn't have evolved in particular ways. But what we discover is that things like carbon atoms could have arisen and did arise by natural mechanisms. So that's not an argument for intelligent design anymore.
Well, we have two steps. One step is something irreducibly complex? The next step is, could it come about by natural means? And of course, relative to the elements, of course, it can come about by natural means. But that doesn't mean that it's not irreducibly complex. That simply, now we're talking about how things came into existence, which is another question.
Okay, it doesn't appear that we're going to reach agreement.
No, actually, I'll agree entirely with him. It just means that irreducible complexity is no longer a useful argument for evolution.
Right.
That's fine with me.
Okay. Yeah. My understanding. Okay. I'm not going to.
Can I answer that?
Yeah. Sure. Quickly.
I think it's an excellent argument for intelligent design. A very good argument, but you have to go a step at a time, and I can't do it in 30 seconds.
Okay. And let me invite at this point members of the audience who have questions to start lining up here. You're going to have to come to the mic and just get out of your chair and come on down. And again, I'm going to limit you to about less than a minute, so there's not going to be any sort of nonsense, because I won't stand for it. And then we can have. So let's see, who had the last? Doctor. Well, should we just go to audience questions? Is that okay? Are you ready for audience questions? Okay. All right. By consent of the participants here, we're going to give about 20-25 minutes to questions or until people get tired or start crying. All right. And if you want to address it to a particular person, that'll be fine, and then we'll let the other person comment briefly, okay? And again, try to limit your questions to. Sure.
Michael Behe was very specific on irreducible complexity being removing a part and stopping the biological function. You've now reduced it to the subatomic level. How is that not the logical fallacy of moving the goal? What's your endpoint?
my endpoint is I agree with Michael Beattie. There are many structures where if you go to a certain point, if you remove beyond a certain point, the structure no longer works. And one comes across that all the time in cell biology, molecular biology, and so on. So I don't see any contradiction.
Okay.
I think that's wonderful because it moves Michael Beattie one step further into cloud cuckoo land.
I'd like to ask a question of Dr. Myers. He indicated that the appendix secondarily serves as an immune system. What in the world is the first reason it exists? I haven't heard you explain that, nor anybody else.
Oh,
And how do you know that? Thank you.
Because we can put together a phylogeny. We can systematically analyze the relationships of the various organisms that are related to creatures like us, and we can ask, what do they use it for? And what we find is that earlier mammals used it as a digestive organ, as part of a storage sac in digesting hard to digest materials like plant matter.
This is for Dr. Bergman. My understanding is that you would like evidence for ID to be taught in schools. Could you please provide some falsifiable evidence? Also, why did you feel the need to open with a personal attack against Dr. Myers? Thank you.
Oh, I didn't know that was personal. I really thought he did a good job. I was honestly did. I didn't know that was a personal attack. So, and if it was taken that way, I apologize because I really thought he did a very good job. Watch the movie and let me know what you think, because I thought he did a good job. But anyways, what was the question again?
Positive evidence.
Oh, positive evidence.
Yeah.
It's easy, positive evidence. All you have to do is prove the other theory, which is Darwinism. If you come up with a source for genetic variation, given the fact that mutations are problematic, come up with a source for genetic variation. Whatever you prove in favor of the opposite, the opposing theory, which is evolution, you have worked against or built a case against intelligent design.
Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, that's a logical fallacy. That's saying it's black and white world that either this thing is true or this other thing is true, and by disproving the one, you've proven the other. That's not the case here. If you look in evolutionary biology, we talk about many other mechanisms besides natural selection and drift, that when you talk to developmental biologists like me, we'll go on and on about evo-devo and genetic constraints and modularity and all these other processes that go on. So if, for instance, you disprove natural selection in one instance, which we often try to do, that does not rule out things like drift, doesn't rule out developmental constraints, and it certainly doesn't demonstrate intelligent design in the creation of the structure.
Okay. Next question.
As I understood, one of the claims of
Can you speak into the mic?
Yes, the universe to come to be have evolved. To be evolved means cannot be like from more inferior things combined or construct. Yeah, only creator necessary for this. Yeah, without creator cannot be evolved. Did you mean that cannot be?
Lost is your question.
Cannot exist without creator. Yeah.
So you can't get complexity without the intervention of a creator. That's intelligent design.
Well, the idea of intelligent design is you're looking for evidence of intelligent input. And I'll give you a good example from, let's quote from Richard Dawkins. I'm sure you all respect what he has to say. So he says, the difference between life, this is on page 405 of his latest book, which I'm just finished. It says the difference between life and non-life is a matter not of substance, but of information. Living things contain prodigious quantities of information. And basically, intelligent design is where we are looking for evidence of information. And as time goes on, this conclusion of Richard Dawkins is becoming more and more true because we realize that the genes are not the boss. They have a boss above the genes. For example, epigenetics.
Okay. I respect your authority. But isn't it? Logical, like step-by-step consequence from this your claim that universe too complex to have evolved. Yeah? But God, by idea, idea claims also that God has created this too complex to be evolved.
Well, I think that's a step beyond what ID would be.
Yeah, or creator, yeah.
So can you get to the point, right? Wrap up the argument.
It means as God is more complex than even universe, it's too complex to be evolved. No, it means God is also.
You're saying for God to create something complex, God must be more complex than that which is created.
Right.
Yeah, and also necessary to be created.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Do you want to speak to that? Well, if the complexity of the universe requires a complex creator, who created the complex creator?
Okay, that's the old idea where you either end up with going back to what they call infinite regression, and of course both creation and evolution have the same problem. Creationists, the problem is, where did God come from? Evolutionists, the problem is, where did the universe come from? Where did the material which produced the Big Bang come from? So we have the same problem in both cases.
Okay. PZ, do you want to speak to the ontological argument?
Well, actually, I have to respond to one comment because Richard Dawkins would be mad at me if I let the slide by. And she quoted his book in defense of intelligent design. That's very misleading again. We do not deny that there's an increase in information in evolution and also in development. What we say, though, is that these increases are a result of natural processes, and that's the source of the center of the debate, is whether natural processes can generate new information or whether you require an intelligent designer. And we can say emphatically that natural processes are very good at generating new information.
Next question, please.
Can I ask a question both of Dr. Bergman and Dr. Myers?
Sure.
Okay, for Dr. Bergman.
Two separate questions.
Yeah, just a quick
I have to think about that. Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe you can answer them shortly.
All right.
Dr. Bergman, you said that religion has no place in science. Is one type of science theology, that is, the study of God?
Okay, good point. Let me add to that I don't think people should be fired for occasionally mentioning their own personal beliefs. I don't think it's a good idea, but on the other hand, I really think academic freedom is critically important, and a lot of my colleagues say things that I strongly disagree with, but on the other hand, I defend their right to say it. If I want to have academic freedom, I have to defend their academic freedom. And I can give you many examples of where people, like the appendix is, in one class, is useless, has no function. And this is what a student reported to me, and the student said, that's a problem I have with that because our book and the class, A&P, Anatomy and Physiology, clearly points out several functions the appendix has. And yet my biology teacher is just telling us that the appendix has no function. I said, well, look it up on the internet, I'll give you some references. And indeed has not one function, but probably 6 or 7 different functions besides the immune function.
Dr. Myers, I got a two-parter here for you.
First 3 questions.
Are the manifestations of intelligent design actually measurable and describable a theory? Or instead, are they obvious facts of a mutually agreed upon phenomena? That's the first question, if you want.
I think that's the last question.
Well, I would say the whole problem here is that they can't define what a manifestation of intelligent design is. So that's where they lose. If you can't tell me that something, if you can't give me a specific positive explanation for why there's an appendix, for instance, as a product of intelligent design, you've lost the argument. You've got nothing to argue.
Okay, Dr. Bergman, I had a point of clarification. You gave an example where you said that a school teaching creationism, their students were said to be at least 2 grades ahead. What exactly were they 2 grades ahead on? If they were going on to university, would they be juniors in their programs rather than freshmen? Were they that far ahead in the subject matter of biology, or were they simply in general on math?
The standardized tests that were given to these students, and I'm talking specifically about homeschooler students. Now that, of course, is a problem because homeschooling, they generally get more attention than students in schools, but I'm also talking about Christian schools, and there are quite a few, and they do collect data on this. Many states require them to collect data where their students are compared to public schools so they can maintain their permission to be able to operate as Christian schools. I'm also talking about students who graduate from schools that teach creationism openly, like Bob Jones University, Liberty University, and other schools. And they followed up their students, for example, going to medical school, and they have found they've done quite well.
So you're saying that they managed to teach both creationism and evolution, and have their students go on to be alright in the evolutionary?
Yes. Several studies have found by teaching both creation and evolution, students have a better knowledge of both and do better on exams on both.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Okay, and let me ask both presenters, if you can cite specific studies, or if you can point people to particular resources, whether those be internet resources or published papers. I think that would help to clarify things a bit here. Next question.
Hi. Well, I want to say that I am a Christian, but I'm not an evangelical or fundamentalist, and Dr. Myers is right on. I want to make a question. What? Okay, I want to make a statement. Okay, it is not necessary for a scientist, an evolutionary scientist, to be an atheist, but it is necessary for every evolutionary scientist not to resort to Deus ex machina in making a scientific explanation. Now, do you understand what I'm saying? Okay, now, because I know there are Christians who are scientists.
TikTok.
Okay. This is all stalking horse. The exile, Darwin to Hitler is all an exile, and you can chime in. The problem is that atheists are not immoral, but they are amoral. And there really isn't an atheist version of evil.
Okay, I think we're going to, unless you have a question.
Well, my question is that true?
Thank you.
That's true. Many people are, quote, evolutionists, and they also are Christians. In my case, I found there to be contrast between the two worldviews, and in my case, I became a Christian because of my science research. I didn't read Creation magazine. I read the scientific literature, and my conclusions were a result of reading the scientific literature. Some people, Christians talk about spiritual experiences, and they go on retreats and so on. And spiritual experience for me is really reading science and nature, which I've subscribed to for 30 years. It's a spiritual high to understand how indeed the world works, and I find this incredibly reinforcing relative to my belief that indeed we were a result of an intelligent designer.
Okay, have you ever read Kierkegaard?
Okay, no, we're not getting into Kierkegaard. Sorry, man, that's off the list. We're not going to do that. Thank you. Next question.
Dr. Bergman, how does intelligent design explain change over time, or do ideas not believe in change over time?
They explain change over time the same way Darwinists do. My guess is a lot of the courses I teach, I have the exact same content that P.Z. Myers covers. There's no problem with change over time. That's not the concern at all. The concern is all sorts of intelligence, and can you go from molecules to man by purely natural means. That's the concern. We well recognize change over time. That's not the concern.
PZ, do you want to speak to that question?
We obviously do teach different courses because I do explain how we get from molecules to man. So,
all right,
but I won't teach that tonight.
Okay. Thank you. Next question, please.
Mine is a question for Mr. Bergman. I think you have a much bigger problem with irreducible complexity than I'd like to get into here. But basically, the idea is that something is functionless if you were to take away.
No, not functionless. It cannot serve a specific function.
Sure, like I think a classic example is the mousetrap. Until you know the spring, it's kind of junk now. Well, in your example, a car is not the same thing, because if you take out, if you were to just leave the engine and the alternator and the electronics, you would have a fantastic gasoline-powered entertainment system.
Which is also irreducible complex.
No, it's not. The engine will serve as a fantastic heater.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Bergman, I really agree with you that maybe if we go to schools that teach us evolution, we are not so smart, because I didn't understand why your definition of irreducible complexity leads to deny evolution. I don't really understand that. Can you explain me?
Okay, the next step is when you have structures that are irreducibly complex, you have to have a certain minimum number of parts before they function. And the concern has always been, back to Darwin, how do you get by natural means that minimum number of parts you need in order to function? A lot of Darwinists say, well, start with a cell. Below the cell, that's not evolution. Well, it's chemical evolution. And they realize we have a problem getting to the cell. Once you get to the cell, evolution is a lot easier because then you can postulate various means that the cell can evolve itself. But nonetheless, the cell is clearly irreducibly complex. Viruses, for example, are not cells. They cannot live on their own. They have to invade other organisms and live inside of other organisms. So the virus is below the level you need in order for life to live.
Hang on, we're just gonna take questions at the mic. PZ, did you want to speak to this?
Viruses are made of carbon atoms, so
Okay, next question, please.
To mark this 150th anniversary year of the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species, I've been reading that book aloud and also Richard Dawkins' recent book to my homeschool children. And I noticed on your set of bullet points, Professor Bergman, you mentioned several common lines of evidence for evolution, but didn't mention the one that's only been around for about 50 years, which is molecular evolution and DNA resemblances among different organisms. And I'm wondering how, in the light of the Human Genome Project and the Chimpanzee Genome Project and the partial genome map of Homo neanderthalis that's recently been developed, how you would make a case for intelligent design of Homo sapiens without common descent with common ancestors of the other great apes.
Thank you.
Well, we're just beginning to look at both the genome of humans. It has been mapped, of course, but all we have is the code, the letters, the A's, G's, and C's, and so on. So as time goes on, we're finding it's a lot more complex than we first thought, and we also are finding there's a lot of more differences between apes, chimps usually, and humans. And there are recently a couple of books which came out which document the many incredible differences between apes and between chimps specifically and humans. So this supports my supposition, and that is mainly there are enormous differences between the two, and as research is done, it is supporting that. So when I get nature next time, I can sit down and have a spiritual experience.
As the moderator requested, could you give the names of those books, please?
I don't have the names with me, but if you give me information, I'll be glad to send them to you.
PZ, do you want to speak on the question of molecular evolution?
I don't know of anybody who's denied that chimpanzees and human beings are different. They are. The thing is that when we've done the molecular analyses, what we find is that chimpanzees and humans are less different from one another than humans and gorillas, for instance, and that we find a pattern of change that fits the evolutionary description.
Okay. Thanks for the question. Next.
My question is for Dr. Bergman. In your opening rebuttal, you agreed with Dr. Myers that intelligent design doesn't have a coherent theory. I kind of thought that was game over. Did you want to take that back?
Okay, my field is primarily medicine, and we are not concerned so much with theories. We're concerned with patients coming in, treating them, and going home well. And whether there's a theory behind it is somewhat irrelevant. We're concerned about whether things work, whether they help people. And I know not too long ago I was talking to one of my colleagues about a new theory of cancer treatment. And I said, this is a theory, this is exciting. It had to do with angiogenesis. And a colleague who's older than I am said basically, I've seen about 50 or 60 theories about cancer causation. It sounds real nice, it sounds good, but let's wait until we can cure patients. Then we'll talk about the results. I don't care about theories. I'm concerned about facts, about curing patients.
Dr. Myers, you want to speak to theory?
I'm very sorry for those students who aren't getting exposure to theory in their classes, because it's important for understanding concepts. But it's still not addressing the question. Should intelligent design be taught in the classroom? And what you're saying is that no theory should be taught. That you think evolution is irrelevant, and you also seem to think that intelligent design is irrelevant. So I think you're right. Game over.
Could I respond to that?
Briefly, sure.
Okay. Well, I'll just drop it.
Okay. How about we just go to the next question?
First of all, nice time. Could you describe
the process by which a radical new idea becomes a part of the standard scientific literature.
Yes,
that question.
Well, because it seems to me that
Yeah.
intelligent design is attempting to do an end run around
Yes,
the
it is.
process, and so I think we should understand the process
And
itself a
it's,
little better.
what it takes is hard work. Probably the classic example in recent history of science is Mitchell's chemiosmotic theory. He came up with an explanation for how mitochondria work, and nobody believed him at first. They thought this was absurd. This whole idea that it was a little proton pump and it was acting like a little dynamo with protons flowing across the membrane. And the way he did it is by sitting down and doing experiments. And year after year, plugging away at it and doing more and more work and getting more and more students who understood the concept and getting them out there and finding out that it was productive work and getting it published. That's what won everybody over, is the accumulation of evidence that tested the hypothesis. That's how you do it.
Dr. Bergman, you want to speak to this question?
Yeah, and that's what intelligent design supporters are trying to do, but it's very difficult when, if you come out of the closet, you're likely going to lose your grants, you're likely to lose your job, you'll likely lose your means of livelihood, and so therefore they have to do the research, as you said, more or less under the cover, so that hopefully the research will be published if it's not too obvious what they're trying to do. My concern in this, one of my primary concerns, is the intolerance that we experience against people who question Darwinism. What you said is correct. Yes, we should do the research. And when we get a grant, we find out it's taken away from us. When we apply for a grant, we find out we don't get it. So what we're doing now is we're going to churches. Churches have to support our research in intelligent design. And there are a number of researchers who are doing research in intelligent design. And yes, hopefully we will eventually have a research body which we can use to support our conclusions. And I hope science works in this case the way you say it should work. In my experience so far, it's not working this way at all.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Dr. Myers, earlier when you were speaking, you said that evolution was fact, and actually I believe evolution is a theory, so because it's not a principle. I don't know if that was just a mess-up, but could you explain your reasoning for this? Because
It's both. I mean, there is a theory of evolution which describes the hypothetical mechanisms that could drive evolutionary processes. And then there's the fact of evolution, which is the body of evidence that shows that organisms transformed over time into the species we see today. And both of those are evolution.
But if it's for creationism being taught, and it's like the same thing, because it's a theory and you're saying, yeah, I agree that creation is also a theory, but then they should both be able to be taught in schools.
No, I'm saying that creationism is not a theory, it lacks a theory. First of all, they deny the fact of evolution, except in very limited domains. So they're rejecting a huge body of evidence, which is one strike against them. And the other is that they have no coherent theory that we can test to explain how these processes occurred. Nobody's explaining to me how the intelligent designer created squirrels, for instance.
Okay.
Show me some evidence of it.
Dr. Bergman, do you want to speak to this theory-fact distinction?
Okay, my concern is when something is empirically demonstrated, I know of no ID supporter that doesn't accept it. Give us the facts, we'll accept it. That's not the problem. The problem is when we go to the theory. That's the disagreement is at. Facts demonstrated, fine. I have to accept it if it's empirically supported. But the concern is when we go beyond this, that's where we have a problem.
Thanks. Good question. Next question, please.
For Dr. Bergman. So to overcome an existing paradigm, which is what you're trying to do, you need to really understand it well. You have a lot of degrees, and I think the only degree that would really come close to touching on the thing you're trying to overthrow, which is evolution, would be your degree in human biology, which you got from Columbia Pacific University. I'm wondering how much you actually covered in the actual material of evolution, like digging in deep. Just to kind of get an idea of that, I was wondering if you could share with us what your PhD thesis was from Columbia Pacific University, briefly, just like the abstract or just in general.
Okay, my PhD thesis there was in the area of magnetic resonance imaging, and I looked at this technique which is utilized in order to understand, first of all, chemical differences, and secondly, to image the human body and other bodies, and MRI has turned out to be an incredibly useful tool in many, many areas. I also looked at other non-invasive imaging techniques, primarily in the area of medicine, its application in medicine.
Okay, can I?
Sure, brief follow-up.
So that seems like a very important thing, and it relates to human biology, but it does not connect to evolution. And I can also ask P.Z. Myers, what was your PhD thesis? Like, was that more related directly to evolutionary development, like in that?
Yes. Yeah. What I was doing was studying a system of neurons in zebrafish that I predicted would exist from a comparative study of other organisms, and then we used a number of techniques to work out exactly where they were and how they developed.
Okay, and then finally, have you ever done any work like this relating to things actually involving evolution? Like there's like biology related to medicine, but then there's like looking at the evolution. And if you haven't actually researched this and looked into this, I wonder if you're really qualified to say that intelligent design can overthrow evolution. Like you have to understand it first.
Yeah, I spent about 30 years doing research in this area and involving myself in projects with colleagues and also publishing in this area, both in psychojournals as well as in, I know some would put them down, but in journals which are oriented toward creation and related areas. So yeah, I've extensively looked into this.
Could I get the list after this email items? I'd love to read it. Thank you.
Okay, we have about 5 more minutes for audience questions, and then we're going to switch to the closing comments by Dr. Bergman first, and then we're going to finish up with Dr. Myers. So about 5 more minutes for questions.
I have one question for both. If you follow the logical conclusion, like let's say evolution is taught in schools, and we raise up a generation of people who only believe evolution and Darwinism, what is the logical conclusion that will happen to that generation?
They'll be smarter. Well, as I was saying in the beginning, that what we need is theory and evidence. That you have to understand these principles of the scientific method. So what we'd end up with is students who are maybe not evolutionary biologists, but they'll be well equipped to analyze the universe critically in whatever they do.
Dr. Bergman, go ahead. You said
morally. Morally, they'll be just like Christians in that there is no ultimate source of right or wrong. We derive our morality from our culture. Christians derive theirs from their culture. We derive ours from our culture. And we do not live in a hedonistic or evil culture. No problem.
Okay, Dr. Bergman.
Just a brief response. We talk of there's a tendency for the assumption that people who believe in ID or creation are stupid or ignorant, etc. I'm working on a book now where I have a dozen Nobel Prize winners who supported creation or intelligent design. And there are many, many, many other scientists who have made major contributions to science who clearly openly supported either ID or the creation worldview. And there are many, many more. I'm discovering more all the time.
Morality?
Pardon?
Evolutionary morality?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, relative to evolutionary morality? I think, well, there are many examples. One example, which I've studied quite extensively, is Nazism, World War II. The fact is, when you look at the scientists in Nazi Germany, Hitler had enormous support from the scientists. When you talk about Nazi Germany, we're not talking about something that happened 2,000 years ago. This was in my father's day. We have an enormous number of documents which clearly show that evolution had a very close relationship with Hitler's ideas. And it's extremely well documented. Not only with Hitler, but with many others. By and large, I've yet to find a single scientist who openly opposed what Hitler was doing. Most were neutral, most acquiesced, and there were a number of scientists who were very strongly in support of Hitler's programs and policies.
Okay. We're not going to have like we're going to remain calm here. Anytime the Nazis get mentioned, things get much more heated. I think it is important to point out that there were many scientists who resisted the Nazis, most especially the German Jewish scientists who left the country. Okay, so let's go to the next question, please, and we have just a couple more minutes for audience questions.
Can you guys repeat the questions?
Sure, I'll do that.
All right, I'd like to thank both of you doctors for coming here. We've got a really angry crowd, really one-sided kind of, I'm hearing a thing. Great handlebars, Dr. Myers, but my question is for you, Dr. Bergman. When does something fall out of its defined criteria for being within that definition and therefore become not as complex and yet within its defining lines so as to disprove irreducible complexity? This sounds like a logical fallacy to me if you are saying that. It sounds like you're trying to redefine definition, the word definition.
Redefine definition?
Yes.
In my area, we...
Okay, so it's not exactly clear to me what the question is, unfortunately. That one was, I think it's something about not quite getting the definition of intelligence, of irreducible. Hang on for 1 second. You don't really get his definition of irreducible complexity, is that correct?
No, I'm saying it's disprovable if he uses his own definition, it's disprovable, and therefore it can't really be a point in fact. It can't.
Okay. So he's saying if you use Dr. Bergman's definition of irreducible complexity, it's not disprovable. Is that correct?
Yes.
And therefore, it's not a point in favor of the theory. This is a logical sort of problem for data. You got that?
No. I'm lost. But let me explain how, in cell biology especially, we use what they call knockout genes. In my area, we took a gene and we removed certain parts of it to see whether it was still functional. And we found out there are certain parts, if we removed it, the gene no longer produced the protein which functioned. If certain other parts were removed, the protein would function. Not as well, but it would function. And so basically what a lot of work done in cell biology is to try to find out what part of the gene is critical and what part is less critical and what part seemingly is not critical at all. So really what we were doing is a lot of research in irreducible complexity. And this is commonly done in the area of cell biology.
Dr. Myers, do you want to?
Yes, we do knockouts, and we find that we can modify the genomes, and they work or they don't work. None of this says anything about intelligent design. It actually fits very well within an evolutionary paradigm.
Okay, last question from the audience. Sorry for the rest of you who have been waiting patiently for us.
Dr. Bergman, as somebody who considers themselves very science-minded, I find it depressing when I know there will be answers that I won't be able to get about things in the universe, about things in biology by the time I die. Do you feel in any way that your switch from atheism to intelligent design was a form to give yourself closure on these issues that you will never be able to answer for yourself?
Let me just repeat the question. So the question was something about this questioner is very deeply science-minded and is very intrigued by the kinds of questions that have very difficult answers or very hard to get answers, and can be almost frustrated by that or challenged by that. And was asking Dr. Bergman if he had switched from atheism, where he might not get answers to these questions, to a religious system where these answers would be readily on offer. Is that correct?
More or less, yes.
I switched to theism purely because of the information that I learned in science. And that is not a not a rare response. It's fairly common. When I saw how the world works, when I understood cell biology, molecular biology, and so on, it led me to the conclusion that indeed intelligent design does explain where Darwinism does not explain, and in a short time I can't really go into a lot of details about that. So closure, no, it opens up a lot more doors. It certainly opens up a lot more problems as well. It certainly opens up a lot of opposition. When I was an atheist, I had a lot of friends. When I left atheism, same thing that happened when I left the Witnesses. Lost a lot of my friends. And I had some very prominent friends, Nobel laureates. They won't correspond with me now. So you're isolating yourself when you accept a theistic worldview, which is a problem. But what can I do? Go back on what I found to be true just to gain acceptance from colleagues? I can't do that, although I thought about it.
Dr. Myers, do you want to comment on that question? All right, so I thank the audience for their thoughtful questions, and what we're going to have now is a 5-minute closing statement from Dr. Bergman, and then a 5-minute closing statement from Dr. Myers, and then it's a good night. So, Dr. Bergman, 5 minutes.
My main concern in this is we need academic freedom, the right to question Darwinism. And there are many, many examples. I'll give you one. I, 10 years ago, published an article which I concluded that junk DNA may not be junk. It may actually have a use, a function. And as time went on, what do we find? More and more research has shown that more and more of the so-called junk DNA has a function. In fact, many scientists are saying now they believe the vast majority, if not all, of the DNA has a function. When I took the position that this junk DNA has a function, I was ridiculed, I was made fun of, I was mocked, I was told I was stupid. I remember one scientist said, "Bergman, look, it's junk. You remove it, there is no effect on the function of the organism. It's junk. Admit it. You're wrong." Well, I said, it may be. I don't know. But in time, this turned out to be correct. A number of people have commented to me that this conclusion that junk DNA has no function because of evolution, you would expect to produce a fair amount of junk DNA, inheriting vestigial DNA, so to speak. Because of this conclusion, a number of scientists have mentioned that they feel this impeded researching this so-called junk DNA. And now this is one of the hottest areas in genetics. We should not have concluded, indeed, that this stuff is junk. We should have said, well, I don't know what it does. It might have some function. Let's look into what it does. So I am saying that we need academic freedom. Termination of people who question, doubt Darwin, I think should stop. We should have the right to be able to question Darwinism. That's what I'm concerned about. That's what I'm asking.
Okay, Dr. Myers, final word.
Okay. I didn't hear anything that supported the idea that intelligent design should be taught in the classroom. I guess I did, right? There's so much to cover here. What I want to close on, though, is some positive results. That when you look at science, when you compare these issues of Nature and Journal and Science and all these other journals in the scientific fields, and you look at what they publish, what you find in recent years is an explosion of new information on evolutionary biology, not intelligent design. Intelligent design was formulated in 1992, and we're still waiting for a theory, a mechanism. We're still waiting for evidence that would provide us some reason to accept it. I want to read another quote to you. This one's from William Dunsky. He's a creationist. He's on the intelligent design side. And this is what he said. In the next 5 years, molecular Darwinism, the idea that Darwinian processes can produce complex molecular structures at the subcellular level, will be dead. When that happens, evolutionary biology will experience a crisis of confidence because evolutionary biology hinges on the evolution of the right molecules. This is a particularly interesting comment because he made it in 2004. You do know what year it is, right? His 5-year deadline is passed, and no, this hasn't happened. Molecular biology is not dead. It's getting stronger than ever. In the past couple of weeks, I've been to 2 major scientific conferences. One was in Chicago at a celebration of the Darwin Year, where some of the biggest names in science got together to discuss progress in their fields. And just this weekend, I just came back from a conference on evolution and development that was held in Indiana. And in all those cases, what you do is you sit down and you are just blown away by all this amazing new evidence that's pouring out to support the whole idea of evolutionary biology. It's gotten stronger and stronger over the years. If you read my blog, yeah, somebody wanted the source. Just go to scienceblogs.com/Pharyngula, all of you. every day. And there's lots of evidence there. But I talk about these conferences, and for instance, I talk about the work of David Kingsley on sticklebacks, which is just amazing stuff. What looked at populations of these fish that differ in their morphology. And what he's done beyond that is then he's gone in and he's discovered which genes have changed to produce these different morphologies. He's looked at the frequency of the forms of these genes in the different populations. He's done experiments where he's gone in and artificially either changed the genes of one species to another one, or vice versa, and he's gotten effects on morphology. He's worked all this stuff out. Molecular evolutionary biology isn't dead. It's gotten stronger than ever. Now I ask you, if you want to teach intelligent design in the classroom, what does ID provide that is equivalent to that? I suspect even the most ardent promoters here of creationism will be stuck. You won't be able to name any similar experiments, any similar measurements, because they're not out there. And that's the bottom line. If we're going to have intelligent design in the classroom, it's got to have some substance to it, and they have not provided that. And I'll stop there.
All right. So let me say thanks to Dr. Ross Olson and the supporting groups in the back. You can get literature from all of them. And thanks to all of you for coming tonight. And I hope you guys have nice conversations as a result of this. Have a good night.
Looked at populations of these